From the command bridge of the resolute conqueror, Supreme Commander Zak of the Kier Empire gazed out into the void between stars, which suddenly felt smaller than ever before. Before him hung a simple yellow star with its third planet glowing blue and green wrapped in white clouds, a sight that would seem beautiful if it wasn't seen through the cold lens of conquest. The data streaming from the scanners confirmed what his eyes suspected. The planet teemed with life, oxygen, nitrogen, atmosphere large, oceans and continents covered in forests, cities and countless biological signatures. The science officer confirmed the dominant species was technically advanced enough to construct primitive satellites and an orbital station, but otherwise unimpressive. Still burning fossil fuels, still fighting among themselves, their technology barely out of their own atmosphere. Nothing they had should pose any threat to the Kier Empire, with 17 successful system conquests. In just the last century, this planet looked like another easy mark. Zak's mandibles twitched in amusement. Another world for the Empire, another species to subjugate. Standard protocol dictated that scouts be sent first, so Zak ordered 3 stealth vessels to break formation and descend toward the planet, invisible to primitive sensors. With adaptive camouflage and null signal emissions, they would arrive within 6 hours, gather intel, and confirm there was nothing unexpected about this world and its people. But 6 hours later, there was nothing. No communication, no telemetry, no signal of any kind. His communications officer stammered the report they had lost all contact with the scout ships. Last location just outside the atmosphere of the planet, and then nothing. Zak's calm posture shifted into a tight knot of tension. Their stealth tech had never failed. Before he demanded answers, but before any could be given, a transmission alert flared across the command board, a signal from outside the fleet, but not from Earth. On instinct, he ordered it displayed, and the image that appeared silenced the bridge. It was a Rigelian, a mercenary species known across the galaxy. This one was old, scarred, and battle-worn, with a cybernetic eye and a voice like sandpaper. He warned them directly, calling out their vessel by name and telling them to turn back. The bridge crew laughed at first, dismissing him as a broken remnant of a lesser force. But when he spoke of the 3 missing scout ships, before Zak could reveal it, the laughter died. The Rigelian Vexilor said he had seen it before with his own people and others. The Krix, the Zolar, each thought the planet was primitive, and each had been devastated. He spoke of a fleet 3 times the size of Zak's, reduced to ash by the humans, who did not fight like others, who did not stop until their enemies could never rise again. Zak challenged him, accusing him of lies, of manipulation. Perhaps he was sent by the humans as part of a ruse, but Vexilor was unmoved. He explained how humanity's technology was chaotic and unpredictable, how they had split atoms while still burning coal, how they cured diseases in days and built weapons without fully understanding them. But what truly made them dangerous was not their technology, it was their spirit when attacked. They did not break, they adapted when cities were destroyed. They grew more united when communications were severed. They created new ones when diseases were unleashed. They found cures in days. They fought not until they tired, but until they won. No matter the cost, Vexilor said his fleet was not merely defeated. It was hunted. He was allowed to live, only to warn others, and now he was passing that warning to Zak. Zak refused to be intimidated. The Empire had never known defeat. But then his bridge crew shouted an alert, dozens, then hundreds, of energy signatures launching from Earth, too fast, too numerous to be natural objects. They were not ships. Not in any form. The Empire knew they were drones. Fast, agile, with energy, readings far beyond their size. And when fired upon, they dodged and danced through the vacuum, attaching themselves to the hulls of Kier ships, then boring through disabling systems. From the inside out, panic spread as one vessel after another began to drift. their power failing life support collapsing. The drones weren't just attacking, they were dismantling the fleet from within. Before long, Earth sent a transmission, not from some random survivor, but from General Maya Chen of the Earth Defense. Coalition speaking fluent galactic standard. She informed the Kir Empire that they had entered restricted space and demonstrated hostile intent, and that this was their one and only chance to surrender. Dzak tried to bluff, invoking the power of the Empire, but Chen cut him off. They had intercepted his earlier conversation with Vexilor and had anticipated this very encounter. The drones were only scouts. She said the true fleet was just now launching, and on the display, thousands of human warships rose from Earth and the far side of the moon, dwarfing anything the Kir fleet could produce. The message was simple: withdraw or be annihilated. For the first time in his career, Dzak chose to retreat not out of weakness, but out of survival. He had no protocol for this, no training to prepare for a world that could not only defend itself, but had used the Kir fleet's own presence to learn, study, and prepare for retaliation. He gave the order to set course for home and ordered every scrap of data about humanity to be preserved and analyzed. Vexilor's warning had come too late to save his pride, but just in time to perhaps save his species, because what had once looked like a world of primitives now revealed itself as something far more dangerous, an enemy that didn't play by the rules, and who, once they started fighting, would not stop until there was nothing left to threaten them again. Vexilor stood as a broken remnant of what was once a mighty fleet. And as he delivered his warning to the Kir Empire, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty and raw memory. He did not speak like a man defeated. He spoke like one who had survived something that should have ended him, and he had not come to beg or plead. He had come to tell the truth. He recounted how his people had made the same mistake, looking at Earth and seeing only weakness, a fractured world using primitive tools, powered by fossil fuels, governed by infighting factions. They had seen nothing of value, nothing that could resist the combined power of a Rigelian assault fleet. They came not to negotiate, but to conquer. Their fleet was vast, armed with the most advanced warships and destructive firepower from 3 star sectors, but none of it mattered because the humans were not what they seemed. They were not unified in the traditional sense. Their military was not organized like empires. Their technology was inconsistent, built by competing nations and corporations with no central doctrine. And yet, when the Rigelians attacked, that inconsistency became their advantage. Chaos became innovation, unpredictability became superiority. The humans didn't respond with fear or surrender. They responded with fury, with speed, with a kind of focused madness. Vexilor remembered the moment their first strike landed on Earth. They had expected shock and collapse. Instead, they were met with a coordinated counterattack, faster than their analysts thought possible. 3 Rigelian cities were vaporized by human weapons they didn't even know existed, and what should have been a victory turned into a nightmare. They deployed biological agents expecting to cripple human resistance, only to discover that human scientists not only developed a cure in a matter of days, but modified the agents and used them against the Rigelians. They tried to block human communications, only to find entire new networks being built in real time, powered by frequencies they had never encountered before. Every strategy, every tactic the Rigelians employed was met with resistance, adaptation, and escalation. The humans refused to lose. Vexilor had seen entire Rigelian fleets vanish in battles that should have been overwhelming victories, and when retreat was ordered, it was already too late because the humans didn't just fight. They hunted, they pursued survivors across space, tracking them through methods the Rigelians didn't understand, striking with unrelenting precision until there was no one left. But Vexilor himself, he had barely escaped limping. away in a damaged vessel with most of his body burned and shattered, replaced by crude cybernetics, and yet the humans didn't forget. They tracked him for years, even across neutral territories. He never stayed in one place for long, always moving, always hiding, because even in their mercy, they never truly stopped chasing him. And that was the message he brought to the Kier Empire, that humanity was not a prey species, but a predator, one that hid behind the mask of civilization and division, one that waited and watched, and when provoked, unleashed something so relentless, so focused that no known species could withstand it. He told them plainly that it wasn't their weapons that made them powerful. It was the way they fought, with desperation, with creativity, with rage and purpose. They fought not for glory or expansion, but for survival. And when survival was threatened, they would become something else, something more terrifying than any empire had ever faced. Vexillor did not ask for trust. He didn't expect gratitude. He had nothing to gain from the warning except perhaps peace before the inevitable end he knew was coming. The humans would find him eventually, and yet he chose to speak to the Kier because no one deserved to face what he had seen. No one deserved to feel the cold realization that their fleet, their strength, their culture, their history was being erased piece by piece. Not out of cruelty, but as a response to aggression. Vexillor described how even when Rigelian ships tried to surrender, it was too late. Their communications were ignored or jammed, their escape routes blocked because humanity didn't fight wars. They ended them not with diplomacy but with finality. He looked Zack in the eye and told him this was his last chance, that even now, if he turned back, perhaps they would be spared. But he knew Zack would not listen. He knew the pride of empires, the arrogance that came with 100 victories. He had lived it himself once, and it had cost him everything he warned them. Anyway, because he remembered what it was like to think yourself the superior force, to see a planet and assume it belonged to you, only to realize too late that you were not the hunter, you were the hunted. And in that moment, as the Kier bridge crew watched this scarred mercenary speak, not with bitterness but with weary conviction, the weight of his words began to sink in. Some still laughed, some dismissed him as a madman broken by failure, but others, especially the veterans, recognized something deeper in his tone. Not fear, not madness, but truth, unshakable, undeniable truth. And though Zack still held command, though the fleet still stood strong in orbit above Earth, Vexillor knew it would not last, because no one had ever listened before, not the Krix, not the Zolar, not the Rigelians, and now not the Kier. He turned off the transmission with a hollow farewell, leaving them with one final thought: may your gods be merciful, because the humans will not be. The silence that followed Vexillor's warning was thick and uneasy, but Supreme Commander Zack refused to allow fear to root itself on his bridge. He dismissed the Rigelian's words as delusion, the ramblings of a defeated creature haunted by failure. Yet before he could reassert control, an officer's voice broke through, trembling with disbelief, as she reported that hundreds of unidentified energy signatures were launching from Earth, multiple points of origin from nearly every continent, and rising at speeds that defied their understanding. Zack demanded identification and was told they were too small to be ships, yet their energy readings were off the scale. The science officer speculated they might be drones, but the data made no sense. Nothing that size should move that fast or carry that much power. Within seconds, the drones had left the atmosphere and were closing on the fleet. The command bridge burst into a controlled chaos as crews scrambled to analyze the threat, assess formation, and ready defenses. Zack ordered all batteries to open. Fire every available weapon was brought to bear. Beams of concentrated energy and high-velocity projectiles lit up the void as the Kier fleet launched a full assault against the approaching swarm. Some drones were destroyed, bursting into flickers of light, but most evaded the barrage with movements that ignored conventional physics, weaving through fire patterns and adjusting their trajectory in real time. The tactical officer reported that they were attaching themselves to the outer hulls of multiple vessels, boring into the ships. At strategic points, critical systems began to go offline one by one. Weapons targeting power distribution, even life support began to fail as alarms screamed across the bridge. Zack demanded isolation of vital systems, but it was too late. Whatever the drones were doing, they were doing it with terrifying precision, spreading like a virus through the heart of his fleet. Entire ships drifted, powerless crews, trapped without control or direction. Panic took root, not just in the younger officers, but in veterans who had never seen anything like it, as the resolute Conqueror itself began to flicker and dim. Emergency power systems kicked in just as another alert blared. This time, from the communications console, they were receiving a message from Earth. Zack ordered it through, expecting more taunts, more psychological games, but what he saw stunned him. A human standing calmly in what appeared to be a military command center surrounded by others in uniform. Her name was General Maya Chen, and she addressed him directly in perfect galactic standard, identifying herself as a representative of the Earth Defense Coalition. She informed him that he and his fleet had violated restricted space, demonstrated clear hostility, and were being offered one and only one opportunity to surrender and withdraw. Zack tried to muster authority, invoking the Kier Empire's might and dismissing the humans as primitive. But Chen interrupted, calmly revealing that they had intercepted the earlier transmission from Vexilor and had anticipated every move. Since then, she explained that what they had encountered were merely scouts, a first response force. The true defense fleet, she said, was only now beginning to leave orbit. The tactical display on the bridge updated, and Zack watched in silent horror as thousands of vessels began to rise, not only from Earth, but from behind the far side of the moon, a hidden armada vast enough to dwarf his own fleet, and entirely undetected until this moment. There was no bluff in the general's voice, no desperation, only certainty when Zack questioned the origin of such force. Chen responded with unshaken resolve, explaining that since the first contact event, humanity had begun preparing not just for defense but for deterrence. They had seen what the Kier Empire represented and built accordingly. Everything from drones to warships to communication networks had been expanded and hardened. Their technology might appear chaotic, but its effectiveness was undeniable. Zack felt the walls of control close in around him. He looked at the dimming lights on his own bridge, saw the flicker of failing systems, heard the faint sounds of crew trying to repair what could no longer be repaired, and understood in that moment that this mission was lost. Not in a battle, but in underestimation. The pride of the Empire had blinded them, and now they were facing a power that had studied them, anticipated them, and chosen to respond with measured, overwhelming force. Zack asked what would happen if they surrendered, and Chen responded clearly and without malice that they would be allowed to leave with a warning. Earth was off limits, and any further aggression would be met with total war. Not just defense, but a counteroffensive that would reach the Kier homeworlds and destroy everything they held dear. There was no arrogance in her words, no threat spoken for effect. It was a promise backed by action and capability, the kind of promise Zack had learned long ago to take seriously. His pride warred with his instincts. The Kier Empire had never retreated without a fight, never walked away from a conquest. But this was not a conquest. This was a lesson, and if he ignored it, he would not be returning home at all. Vexilor's warning echoed in his mind, reminding him that humans did not fight for power. They fought for survival, and once they began, they didn't stop until their enemies could never rise again. For the first time in his long military career, Zack gave the order to withdraw, not with defiance, but with quiet resignation, knowing full well that he would be questioned, judged, perhaps even punished, but also knowing that to stay would mean extinction. The fleet, what was left of it, began to disengage, drifting backward from Earth's orbit as human vessels moved into formation, watching, not attacking, simply ensuring the Kier did as promised and left in peace. Zack slumped into his command chair, watching the tactical screen filled with enemy ships, and for the first time he wondered not what humanity could do, but what they might become given time and the will to act. Because what he had seen today was not a desperate planet lashing out, but a species that had chosen to survive at any cost, and was ready to show the galaxy just what that meant. 7 solar cycles had passed since the retreat, and within the towering halls of the Grand Council chamber of the Kier Empire, the atmosphere was tense and suffocating. Supreme Commander Zack stood alone at the center, surrounded by the cold gazes of high-ranking officials and the imposing presence of Emperor Krastak himself. The silence was broken only by the Emperor's voice, devoid of emotion as he stated the unthinkable that Zack had retreated from a single primitive world after an empire built on conquest had crushed 17 systems in less than a century. This retreat was not just unprecedented, it was unacceptable, but Zack did not falter. He stood firm and declared that Earth was not what they believed, that the data they had relied upon was catastrophically wrong, and that the species they thought were primitives had not only repelled the fleet but had done so with coordination and force that defied all known metrics. He ordered the holographic display activated, and before the council appeared, footage captured just before the fleet had been disabled swarms of drones operating with impossible agility, the stealth of a hidden armada rising from behind the moon, and most importantly, fragments of human technology that had no pattern, no clear development tree, no logic to them, yet demonstrated devastating effectiveness. He explained that humans did not develop technology in a straight line. Like other species, they skipped stages, combined eras of progress in reckless and effective ways. They had split atoms before mastering safe planetary travel, created artificial intelligence while still relying on combustion engines, and built war machines without always understanding their full consequences. The chaos in their innovation was precisely what made them so dangerous. High General Vosht, the Emperor's most trusted military advisor, interrupted him with disbelief, questioning whether such inconsistencies made humanity a threat or simply an outlier. Zack responded with certainty, stating that the threat was not hypothetical. It was already unfolding. He referenced not only the Regellians, but the Krix and Zolar, all of whom had made attempts on Earth and all of whom had been destroyed or driven off. He detailed how the humans had tracked Vexilor across space, had hunted him relentlessly, and eventually captured him, confirming their capacity for long-term strategic operations and intelligence. Gathering, the chamber murmured as the implications began to take hold. If Earth had indeed survived multiple assaults, then it stood to reason that they had been collecting not only data, but also technology and adapting it for their own use. Zack suggested that this was why their drones bore similarities to Krix architecture, albeit heavily modified. It was likely that humanity had been harvesting and enhancing alien tech from every failed invasion they encountered, and in doing so had grown exponentially stronger. The Emperor narrowed his 4 eyes and asked the question that none had dared voice. Were they witnessing the rise of a new power, one that, if left unchecked, could challenge the supremacy of the Kier Empire? Zack answered with the word that silenced the room. Yes, and then he said something no Kier commander had spoken in living memory, that this situation called not for subjugation, but for extermination. The word hung heavy over the chamber, a term reserved for only the most extreme threats and rarely ever considered by a culture that prided itself on conquest, not destruction. Zack did not suggest it out of malice, but out of survival. He explained that the humans had made their intentions clear through General Chen's broadcast. If provoked again, they would not simply defend themselves. They would bring war to the Empire itself. They would strike at its heart with allies, technology, and tactics that the Kir were not prepared for. The Emperor was silent for a long time, then slowly nodded and gave the order to begin preparations for war, not as a conquest, but as a purge, a full mobilization of resources, fleets, and weapons to eliminate the human threat before it could grow any stronger. He appointed Zack to lead the operation, not as punishment, but because of his unique understanding of the humans. He had seen them firsthand, faced their strength, and lived to tell the tale. Zack bowed, accepting the responsibility, but as he left the chamber, he could not shake a deep unease, because even as he prepared for what was to come, he sensed that the Empire was still not grasping the full scope of what they were dealing with. Humans had not just won, they had changed the rules of engagement. They had exposed the limits of the Kir's tactics and shown what a determined species could do when pushed to the edge. And even now, with extermination on the table, Zack feared they were already too late, because if humans had done so much in response to a single failed invasion, what might they have done in preparation for the next one? The gears of war were turning again, but this time Earth would not be caught by surprise. This time they would be ready, and Zack knew that whatever the outcome, it would not be a battle. It would be a reckoning, and one that might decide not just the future of the Kir Empire, but the fate of the entire galaxy. Months after the Imperial Council had approved the plan of extermination, the largest fleet in the history of the Kir Empire surged through deep space, heading for the Sol system. Not one fleet, but three, each approaching from different angles, designed to trap Earth in a perfect encirclement with overwhelming force and no chance for escape. This was not a stealth mission. This was a declaration. The Empire was not just returning, it was coming to end the threat once and for all. Aboard the new flagship, the Imperial Judgment Supreme Commander Zack watched the synchronized arrival with grim focus. Their re-entry into normal space was perfectly timed, each fleet dropping out of FTL within seconds of each other, surrounding the target world in a pincer of firepower. But as they slowed to combat speed, something unexpected appeared on the sensor structures, massive and numerous. Not debris, not orbiting ships, but fortified installations. Spread across the void surrounding Earth, the officers quickly confirmed what they were seeing. These were orbital platforms organized in multiple defensive layers, constructed between Earth and its moon, and even further near Mars's orbit, were still the surface of the moon, now bristled with what appeared to be weapon emplacements. And between Earth and Mars, an immense structure was under construction, a ring-like megastructure far beyond anything the Kir had encountered in the region. Zack could barely comprehend what he was seeing. How could this level of infrastructure have been built in only half a year? The communications officer interrupted the stunned silence with another alert. They were being hailed by Earth. Zack ordered the transmission through, expecting perhaps another desperate plea. Instead, the face that appeared was all too familiar. General Maya Chen, standing now in a far more advanced command center and addressing him without formality. "Commander Zack," she said plainly, "I see. The Kir Empire has made its decision." Zack responded with a gesture toward the infrastructure, asking how they had built so much so fast, to which Chen replied with calm assurance, "We've been preparing since your retreat, and I must thank you for the warning." Zack repeated, confused. Chen explained that before they allowed his damaged fleet to leave their systems, they had accessed and copied its entire databank. everything from fleet compositions to technological specs to cultural doctrines. Earth had known since that moment that the Empire would return and had spent every second preparing for it, not just with weapons but with strategy and alliances. Zack reeled as new signals lit up the tactical display ships, emerging from behind the moon, from asteroid belts, from high Mars orbit ships that were clearly not of human origin. Krix, Jolari, others, all former victims, or rivals of the Kier Empire, and now all allied under a single banner. Chen explained that humanity had reached out to these species with a single message. They shared a common enemy, and the result was the coalition now standing against him. Zack asked if they had captured Vexillor. Chen confirmed that they had, and that he had been extremely helpful in painting a picture of galactic politics and imperial behavior he had once tried to hide among the stars by leading fleets toward Earth, hoping to be forgotten in the destruction. But instead, he had given humanity insight, leverage, and eventually power. Zack realized too late. What had happened? Humanity had not only prepared for war, they had prepared for galactic leadership. The tactical officer shouted a new alert. Energy readings from the orbital platforms were spiking beyond sensor limits. The very fabric of space around the Kier ships began to ripple. Chen warned him calmly they were not targeting his ships directly, but the space around them. Then the weapons fired, not in traditional blasts, but in focused distortions of space itself, gravity wells, artificial voids that pulled at the ships, immobilizing them, disabling escape. The Empire's vessels were caught like insects in amber, struggling against forces they were never designed to face. Some captains panicked, opening fire on the anomalies or on approaching coalition ships. But their efforts were useless. The weapons had no effect, and the retaliation from the Allied fleet was swift and surgical. Zack ordered a ceasefire across all fleets, watching helplessly as the pride of the Empire was dismantled, not by brute force, but by planning, unity, and superior understanding of hybrid technologies. Chen addressed him again, offering one last chance to surrender unconditionally, to avoid complete destruction. She explained that even if he complied, not all his captains might, and they could not guarantee safety for those who defied the order. Zack faced the greatest decision of his life. His duty screamed at him to fight to the bitter end, but the reality in front of him told a different story. Pride and protocol would lead to extinction not just of a fleet, but of his entire civilization. And somewhere deep inside, the voice of Vexillor echoed, reminding him once more that when humans begin to fight, there is no escape. With the weight of an empire on his shoulders, Zack gave the only answer left: ceasefire, all ships stand down. Surrender was no longer a defeat. It was a survival tactic, and he knew now that it might be the only chance his species had left, not just to avoid annihilation, but to one day learn from the mistake that brought them to the brink of extinction in the first place. 3 standard years after the surrender, Vexillor stood on the observation deck of a human diplomatic vessel orbiting a neutral system, watching as representatives from 27 former client species of the Kier Empire gathered to sign the Galactic Cooperation Treaty. The air aboard the ship was quiet, yet charged with history being made. Every movement on the diplomatic floor below symbolized a new era where war was no longer the default solution, where fear no longer governed diplomacy. Standing beside him was General Maya Chen, no longer in uniform, now wearing the robes of an ambassador. Her posture still disciplined, but her tone softer when she turned to him and asked if seeing the Kier brought low satisfied him. Vexillor took a long moment to respond. For years, he had dreamed of revenge, dreamed of seeing the Kier kneeling before those they once dominated. He had imagined their cities in ruin, their leaders disgraced, their legacy shattered. But now that it had come, not through bloodshed, but through structured diplomacy and restraint, he realized something more profound had taken place. What stood before him was not just a defeated empire, it was a transformed one, dismantled and reshaped by the very species they had once sought to erase. Vexillor admitted that he thought revenge would be sweeter, but instead found peace had given him something deeper, the quiet comfort of knowing that a future had been secured not just for his people, but for others who had once lived under the boot of conquest and control. Chen nodded, agreeing that peace often held a weight that glory could not, and yet she reminded him that humanity had not always embraced peace so quickly. Their own history was marred with conflict, betrayal, division, and war, and it was only through the hard lessons of survival that they had come to understand the value of unity and cooperation. The irony was not lost on either of them that it took facing extinction to realize how much more could be achieved through collaboration than through domination. Vexillor noted how prepared humanity had been even during the war, how their alliances, their weapons, their defensive layers all suggested a species that expected betrayal, that understood peace could only come after stability and never before. Chen smiled, faintly quoting an old Earth phrase, "Hope for peace, prepare for war," and it struck him how accurately it summarized everything he had come to learn about humans. He turned to her then and asked the question that had long weighed on his mind. Why had they spared him after all the fleets he had led to their doorstep, after using others as distractions, after giving them every reason to brand him a war criminal and end his life? Chen paused and then answered with unexpected honesty. They had considered it, she admitted, but ultimately they had recognized something in him, something they too understood, a desperate will to survive at any cost, the same drive that had once fueled their own worst decisions and also their greatest breakthroughs. It was what made humans so dangerous, but it was also what made them capable of empathy. Even for their enemies, Vexillor looked back at the diplomatic floor where old rivals now shook hands, or their equivalent appendages, where languages once used for declarations of war were now being used for mutual agreements and future planning. He acknowledged quietly that most of the delegates still feared humanity despite their kindness, despite their offers of support, despite the freedom they had brought, that fear remained. Chen did not deny it, but she expressed hope that over time fear would turn into respect and eventually into trust, though she also made clear that if some new threat emerged, one that could not be reasoned with, one that ignored diplomacy and came with conquest in its heart, then that threat would be met not just with resistance, but with overwhelming unity and force, because the lesson humanity had taught the galaxy was simple. Once you fight humans, there is no escape, not from their wrath and not from their determination to protect what they believe in, what they build, what they choose to value. Vexillor understood now that their greatest strength was not in their ships or weapons or strategies, but in their ability to adapt, to become what the moment required in war. They were warriors in peace, they were diplomats, and in crisis, they were survivors. Chen gestured toward the gathered delegates, reminding him that this was the result of that strength, not just victory, but legacy, the kind that reshaped civilizations and created something better than what came before. She told him that by choosing to warn others, by choosing to be honest, even after everything he had done, he had helped make this moment possible, and that perhaps that could be his legacy, not the destruction he once caused, but the future he had helped create. Vexillor nodded slowly, watching as the Galactic Council prepared to convene its first session. The chamber filled with species that had once been divided by fear, now bound by a common goal and shared understanding. The galaxy had changed, not because humanity forced it to, but because humanity showed what was possible when survival was met with compassion, when strength was used not just to defeat, but to uplift, as the diplomatic anthem began to play. Vexillor found himself hoping that the future would be shaped more by this moment than by the wars that came before, and he knew deep down that if any new force threatened what had been built, humanity would not hesitate to defend it with everything they had, because the truth remained: once you fight humans, there is no escape. And now the galaxy understood what that truly meant. From the moment the Galactic Cooperation Treaty was signed, the fate of the Kier Empire was no longer in its own hands. Stripped of its military, dismantled from within, and placed under the supervision of the newly formed Galactic Council, the once dominant force was now a shadow of its former self. The very species that had expanded aggressively across 17 systems now submitted reports to former enemies and followed directives from allies it once viewed as inferior. Supreme Commander Tzak. Now General Tzak, under coalition oversight, found himself not on a bridge commanding fleets, but in administrative chambers documenting cultural protocols, technological schematics, and strategic failures. Humiliation was deep, but not without meaning, for in those quiet halls of rebuilding, he began to see what Vexillor had tried to express years ago, that survival was not about dominance, it was about adaptability. The humans had shown that in the most painful way possible, and now the Kier were forced to do the same. And as the galaxy watched the fall of an empire, what caught most off guard was not the collapse itself, but the speed at which humanity had risen to fill the void they did not claim. Territory they did not install puppet governments. Instead, they brokered treaties, enforced stability, and extended an open hand where once others might have enforced a clenched fist. Earth had become something more than a symbol of resistance. It had become a fulcrum around which the balance of interstellar power was recalibrating, and the reason was simple. Humans had fought not to conquer, but to stop being conquered. They had shown what happens when a species chooses to end a cycle rather than continue it, and in doing so, they attracted allies not through fear, but through shared interest, through the promise that together they could build a galaxy defined not by subjugation, but by cooperation. Still beneath the surface of this fragile peace, a quiet tension remained. There were those in the remnants of the Kier military-industrial complex who whispered of vengeance, who spoke of biding time and rebuilding in secret. But Zak no longer listened to them. He had seen too much. He had watched drones tear through ships like paper. He had felt the gravity wells lock fleets in place and render centuries of war doctrine irrelevant. He had seen the cold eyes of General Chen not filled with hate, but with unshakable resolve, and he knew the truth. Even if others refused to admit it, the humans had let them go, once not out of weakness, but as a warning, and if that warning was ignored again, the next time there would be no restraint, and this understanding began to spread even among former commanders and admirals as reports from neutral systems began to show signs of human tech helping rebuild ruined infrastructure, drones assisting with agricultural growth. AI systems offered to integrate with struggling economies. It became clear that humanity was not preparing for the next war. They were preparing for a future where war was no longer necessary, and that was perhaps more terrifying to some than any weapon, because it meant the old way was dying, the Kier way, the conqueror's way, and replacing it was something unpredictable, something dangerous in its idealism and effective in its execution. A united galaxy was not what the old empires were built for, and yet here it was being shaped day by day by the very species once mocked as primitive. Zak found himself in diplomatic meetings where former enemies of the Kier now sat side by side with Earth envoys discussing trade routes, educational exchanges, and planetary restoration programs. It was not easy to accept, but the evidence was overwhelming. The humans had not only fought back, they had built something in the aftermath, and that something was gaining traction. The new alliance was not perfect. It faced challenges from within and pressure from the edges of explored space. But it had something the old empire never did: genuine support from those it protected, because unlike the Kier, who ruled through fear, the humans offered agency, choice. A seat at the table. Vexilor's decision to warn the Kier had not saved the fleet, but it had saved something else: the possibility of change. And even as the older generations clung to their pride, younger Kier diplomats, engineers, and even artists began to travel to Earth to learn to engage and to question the old ways. Zack watched them leave with a strange mix of hope and sorrow. Hope that they would return with understanding, sorrow that it took so much destruction to create the opportunity for peace. And yet he could not deny that it was happening. The humans had redefined power in the galaxy, not through force alone, but through an adaptability that turned every weakness into a strength, every defeat into a lesson, and every enemy into a potential ally. The final warning they had given still echoed across star systems, not just as a threat, but as a truth. Once you fight humans, there is no escape. Not from their retaliation, not from their strategy, and not from the consequences of provoking them, but also not from their mercy. Not from the systems they build after the war ends. Not from the alliances they forge, or the future they're determined to create. And that was what made them unstoppable, because they did not just end wars. They changed what followed, and the galaxy had no choice but to change with them. As the months turned into years, the ripple effects of the failed Kier invasion continued to reshape the galaxy in ways no one could have predicted. Earth, which had once been dismissed as a primitive, fractured world, now stood at the center of a vast network of alliances, trade, routes, and cultural exchanges. Humanity had done something no other species had managed to do in living memory. They had turned war into unity, defeat into direction, and fear into opportunity. What surprised many observers was that humans had not capitalized on their newfound power by expanding territory or imposing dominance. Instead, they used their influence to build bridges between former enemies, reforge broken trust, and create systems designed to prevent the very kind of imperial aggression that had nearly destroyed them. And yet, underneath that hope was a lesson too deeply carved into the memories of those who had challenged them, a lesson reinforced by the orbital remains of the Kier fleet, which still drifted in silent formation just outside Earth's moon, a reminder that their mercy had limits and their tolerance was not without conditions. In the rebuilt Galactic Council chamber, where species that once feared extermination now debated policy on equal footing, Vexilor often sat silently, observing the proceedings. The same man who had once led fleets into human space now bore witness to a kind of justice that did not need weapons to enforce its will. One day, during a break in council deliberations, he met with a younger delegate from a recently liberated world who asked him quietly why he had stopped fighting, why he had allowed himself to work with those he had once tried to destroy. Vexilor answered not with grand speeches, but with memory. He spoke of the moment his fleet vanished, not in battle but in confusion, overwhelmed by a species that should have been broken by its own contradictions, and yet had risen stronger with every blow they took. He told the young delegate that it wasn't human weapons that defeated him. It was their mindset, their refusal to accept loss, their obsession with learning, improving, surviving, adapting. Even in chaos, they found order, and in destruction, they planted the seeds of new systems. And it was then that he realized he was not looking at conquerors. He was looking at survivors who had chosen to build rather than dominate, to include rather than control. And that was why he stopped fighting, because they were not fighting for power. They were fighting for something bigger, something that could not be destroyed with fleets or erased with war. The young delegate nodded and asked if the galaxy should be afraid of the humans. And Vexilor, after a long pause, said, Not afraid, respectful, cautious perhaps, but not afraid because the moment fear ruled the way others treated Earth was the moment the cycle would start again, and humanity had shown that once provoked, they would not hesitate to end that cycle, no matter the cost. Supreme Commander Zack had once believed himself immune to fear, but now he understood what Vexillor meant. It was not the fear of pain or defeat. It was the fear of irrelevance, of being caught in a future that no longer belonged to empires Zack had watched as human advisors helped former enemy worlds rebuild not through colonization but through cooperation. Their technology, once used to defend their homeworld, was now deployed to clean toxic atmospheres, repair ecosystems, stabilize tectonic faults, and protect orbital paths from ancient war debris. Their ships flew as envoys, their drones assisted with medical triage, their AI systems taught history, law, and science in languages never before heard on Earth itself. The planet that had once struggled with its own divisions had become a cultural crossroad of the stars. Cities like New Geneva, Atlas Haven, and Pacific Reach had transformed into diplomatic centers where first contact protocols were established and enforcement arms of the Council were trained in peacekeeping rather than warfare. And yet, behind every peaceful interaction was the unspoken understanding that if necessary, the humans could and would return to war in an instant, should the galaxy forget the lessons learned. The final warning once given would not need to be repeated, because everyone who mattered already understood. Once you fight humans, there is no escape. Not from their retaliation and not from the systems they build. Afterward, the Kier Empire was no longer a threat, but its legacy still echoed, and Zack found himself leading lectures and writing reports on everything. His people had misunderstood everything they had overlooked. Everything they had assumed was weakness, but had turned out to be humanity's greatest strength. He described how Earth had never been unified in the way empires imagined unity. Instead, it was built on tension, on balance between chaos and control, between risk and reason, and it was that imbalance that produced innovation, not in orderly steps but in brilliant bursts, forged in pressure and necessity. He told his successors that the real power of humanity was not their weapons but their will, the need to protect not just their own lives, but their values, their stories, their chance to choose their path. When the Kier fleet first arrived over Earth, they thought they were staring down at a disorganized civilization, barely clinging to advancement. But in reality, they were standing on the edge of a volcano, dormant but deep, and when it erupted, it did not destroy out of rage, but out of survival. And what it left behind was not ruin, but the foundation of a new order. The end of the old way had not come with an explosion, but with a choice. The choice to listen to a warning, the choice to retreat, and in doing so, unknowingly, allow something greater to take root, something that no empire could have built and no single species could control. Zack finally understood what made humans different. It was not their intelligence or their firepower or even their adaptability. It was that they could be both destroyers and healers, warriors and diplomats, merciless and merciful. And in that duality, they had become something new, not rulers of the galaxy, but its stewards, its protectors, its reckoning force, and its hope all at once. Looking back, Vexillor often wondered if any of it could have been prevented, if the warnings had come sooner, or if someone with enough authority had listened when there was still time to choose another path. Perhaps the Kier Empire would not have needed to fall. Perhaps lives could have been spared. Perhaps his own hands would not be stained with the consequences of decisions made in desperation. But deep down he knew the truth. The tragedy had been inevitable, not because it was fate, but because the mindset of conquest had run too deep, arrogance too firmly rooted in the leaders who believed strength alone could shape the stars. And in their certainty, they overlooked the most critical factor of all, the human factor. They had not prepared for a species that would build its greatest weapons under pressure, that would unify in the face of extinction, that would sacrifice everything, not for territory, but for the right to determine their own future even now. Years later, when Earth had become a beacon of interstellar diplomacy, there were still those who doubted, who questioned how long humanity's restraint would last and what would happen if the wrong species pushed too far again. Vexillor knew the answer. He had seen the line that humanity would not allow to be crossed, not because they were bloodthirsty or imperial, but because once they deemed something an existential threat, they responded in kind, not with equal force, but with overwhelming resolve, the kind that leaves nothing to chance, nothing to rise again. The final war with the Kir Empire had not been their first battle, and it would not be their last, but it had been the one that changed everything. It taught the galaxy that survival was no longer about strength alone. It was about alliances, about foresight, about knowing when to fight and when to build. And that was a lesson only humanity had been willing to live by. Vexillor remembered walking through the ruins of one of the Kir orbital shipyards after the war, not as a prisoner but as an invited witness, escorted by a human engineer who explained how they were recycling the materials into a research station to study gravitational anomalies for peaceful application. He remembered standing in silence, watching drones dismantle a structure he had helped fund decades ago, and realizing that this was the future he had once tried to prevent and now helped protect. He thought of the young Kir students who now studied alongside human scientists, learning not how to destroy, but how to preserve, how to cooperate, how to innovate without conquest. He saw them ask questions their parents never dared to consider, and he began to believe that maybe change was truly possible, not just forced by defeat, but embraced by choice. Vexillor often spoke to those who survived on both sides of the conflict, soldiers who once fired at each other and now shared meals on neutral ground. He listened to their stories and heard a common thread, not of hate but of confusion at how easily they had been led into believing that humans were just another primitive race waiting to be conquered, and now they all understood the same truth. The real danger had never been Earth's weapons. It had been Earth's capacity to evolve faster than its enemies could plan for when the Regellians attacked. They had expected submission and were met with defiance when the Krix deployed bioweapons. They were met with cures when the Kir brought fleets. They were met with alliances, and all of it had grown from the same root, the human instinct to survive, no matter what it took, no matter what it cost. Vexillor did not worship humans. He did not believe they were infallible. He had seen their flaws, their infighting, their struggles with their own past. But what made them remarkable was that despite those flaws, they learned, they adapted, and they kept going. They did not let the weight of their mistakes stop them from building something better, and that was what made them different. They didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to keep moving forward, and when others tried to stop them, they responded with the full force of a species that had learned the price of hesitation. Zack, too, came to understand this, not just as a commander, but as a witness to what followed the surrender he had feared. Disgrace, execution, even exile. But instead, he had been tasked with helping rebuild, and in that responsibility, he found a different kind of honor, one that did not require victory, only honesty. He documented the Empire's mistakes, outlined every failure in their strategy, every flaw in their assumptions, and presented them to the Galactic Council, not as excuses but as warnings to others. And he concluded every report with the same line: once you fight humans, there is no escape. Not because they seek vengeance, but because they never stop learning and they never stop preparing for what comes next. In the end, Vexillor found a strange kind of peace, not in forgetting what he had done, but in seeing that his final choice had helped steer the future away from another. He stood beside Ambassador Chen, watching young diplomats shake hands with former rivals, and thought of all the lives saved because humanity had shown both strength and restraint, both wrath and mercy, and maybe that balance was what the galaxy had always needed, but had never known how to find until a blue planet with a chaotic past and a defiant heart had forced everyone to see that peace is not the absence of war. It is what you choose to build after surviving it. As the first session of the new Galactic Council began, and the delegates took their seats beneath banners representing not empires but cooperation, Vexilor remained on the observation deck, quietly reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. He had watched civilizations fall and rise, witnessed betrayal and redemption, and stood at the edge of extinction, only to find that survival sometimes came from the most unexpected places, not from strength, not from legacy, but from a willingness to change, to adapt, to let go of what was and fight for what could be. The humans had not sought to become leaders of the galaxy, yet they had become exactly that. Not through conquest, but through their refusal to be broken, their refusal to surrender not just to an enemy, but to despair. They had every reason to collapse under the weight of invasion, and instead they stood up, not with vengeance, but with vision. He had seen their cities burn, their fleets scattered, their skies darkened by foreign aggression, and still they had chosen to unify, not to retaliate blindly, but to ensure it would never happen again. They fought not for domination, but for the chance to build a future. And then when victory was in their hands, they did not repeat the mistakes of those who came before them. They did not enslave or humiliate. They offered peace, they offered structure, they gave their enemies a choice. And in that act, they became something more than just survivors. They became architects of a new era. In this moment, Vexilor finally understood the true meaning of the warning he had tried to deliver. Once you fight humans, there is no escape, not just because of their tenacity or their innovation or their firepower, but because they will become what the moment demands. They will become the shield if defense is needed, the sword if war is brought to their doorstep, the healer if wounds must be mended, and the builder if ruins must be restored. They do not seek destruction, but if forced, they will end a threat completely. And if given peace, they will nurture it fiercely. In this truth lay both a warning and a promise, one that echoed far beyond Earth and the stars above, and one that should be remembered not in fear, but in respect for all the technology, for all the strategy, for all the raw survival instinct. The core of humanity's strength was, and always would be, choice, the choice to fight or to forgive, the choice to defend or to destroy, the choice to rise after every fall, and to never let the darkness of history define the future. General Chen, now ambassador. Chen stood beside him as the council session opened, and the first words of a new galactic constitution were read aloud. Words written not just in treaties and laws, but in sacrifices and scars. The galaxy was watching, some with hope, others with doubt, but none with ignorance anymore. They all knew what humanity was capable of, and more importantly, what they stood for. Vexilor turned to her and asked quietly, "Do you think it will last?" And she looked back without hesitation. "It will, if we keep remembering why we fought, not for power, not for pride, but for peace." The ceremony ended with the raising of a single emblem, a new symbol, one that combined the stars of multiple worlds, interlinked not as conquered territories, but as equals, united by something far stronger than fear. Shared experience, shared resolve, and above all, shared responsibility. And in that final image was the lesson that echoed beyond politics and beyond planets. A lesson that matters not just to galaxies, but to us here in our real world. because history has shown that power unchecked becomes destruction, that unity built on fear cannot last, that peace must be fought for not with weapons but with will, and every generation must choose whether to repeat the cycles of the past or break them for something better. The story of humanity in that distant future is a mirror of what we face now. On Earth, divided and uncertain and often afraid, we are still capable of rising, still capable of building something new out of the chaos, but only if we remember that the real strength of a people is not how they conquer, but how they recover, not how they destroy, but how they choose to protect. And that once you stand for something greater than yourself, there truly is no escape from the weight of that responsibility, nor from the legacy it can create when handled with courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that a better world is always worth fighting for.